Today, we'll begin our discussion on runoff volume generation, a critical concept in water quality analysis. Understanding how runoff is generated is essential because it forms the basis for calculating the mass loadings of pollutants in our water systems. This presentation is brought to us by Harvey Harper and Marty Wanyalista. In this module, our primary goal is to understand how rainfall excess, also known as runoff volume, is calculated. We'll begin by defining what these terms mean, considering the various watershed and rainfall characteristics that govern how much water runs off a surface. Then we'll delve into the widely used curve number, or CN method, explaining its principles and demonstrating how it's applied to determine annual rainfall excess. Finally, to solidify your understanding, we'll walk through several example projects and calculations that illustrate the practical application of these methods. Runoff is an essential part of the larger hydrologic cycle, representing the water that flows over the land surface. The generation of this runoff is a complex process influenced by several critical factors. Naturally, precipitation is a primary driver. The amount and intensity of rainfall directly dictate the potential volume of runoff. However, it's not solely about the rain itself. The characteristics of the land also play a significant role. Soil types, for instance, dramatically affect how much water infiltrates the ground versus how much flows over it. Different land covers, such as forests, agricultural fields, or urban areas, also lead to vastly different runoff volumes. Within this, impervious areas are particularly important. These are surfaces like roads, rooftops, and parking lots that prevent water from soaking into the ground. A key concept here is directly connected impervious areas, or DCIA. These are impervious surfaces where runoff flows directly into a storm drain or a receiving water body, without the opportunity for infiltration elsewhere. Differences in these land cover characteristics, particularly the extent of DCIA, can significantly alter the overall volume of runoff. Our primary interest in understanding runoff volume extends beyond just the water itself. We need to calculate the mass of pollutants that are carried within this runoff, both those discharged directly into surface waters and those that might infiltrate into the ground. While the slide emphasizes runoff, it's also useful to remember that stream flow, which is often used to validate these annual calculations, is actually a composite of this surface runoff volume and the base flow originating from groundwater. Managing runoff, especially through infiltration techniques, can inadvertently transport some of these pollutant masses into receiving waters via the groundwater. This is a critical consideration in sensitive regions like springs and estuary areas, where the pollutant load from groundwater inputs may also need careful management. Here we'll discuss runoff volume coefficients, specifically the ROC and C values. A runoff coefficient in general reflects the proportion of rainfall that ultimately becomes runoff under specified conditions. When we're talking about annual runoff volume, we use the general term runoff coefficient, or simply ROC. The ROC is calculated by taking the sum of the rainfall excess from each and every rainfall event over a year, and then dividing that by the total rainfall over that same year. In essence, it tells us what fraction of the annual rainfall ends up as annual runoff. It's important to distinguish the ROC from the C values used in the rational formula for flood control, which you see here. Q equals C times I times A in this formula. C is an estimate of the runoff proportion of rainfall, but it's specifically for a design storm event, which typically has a long return period, not a single year. While both are called runoff coefficients and represent a ratio of runoff to rainfall, the rational formula's C values are intended for sizing pipes and managing specific, often intense design storm conditions. These rational formula runoff coefficients cannot be used for estimating overall runoff volumes under non-design storm or annual conditions, as their underlying assumptions and applications are quite different. When we're evaluating the relationship between rainfall and the resulting average yearly runoff, a specific runoff calculation method needs to be selected. For this analysis, multiple models were considered. These included the SCS, or National Resources Conservation Service, curve number method, ICPR, and SWIM. Ultimately, The SCS or NRCS curve number methodology was selected for our analysis. We'll often refer to it as the SCS method, as it was originally developed and is broadly known by that name, though it is now supported by the Federal National Resources Conservation Service. This method was chosen due to the overwhelming information supporting its use and its widespread acceptance in professional practice. It's a very common method employed by most civil engineers and integrated into many proprietary models. We'll be using this particular model to calculate annual runoff coefficients, or ROC values, for various meteorological sites throughout Florida. We'll now delve into the SCS curve number, or CN methodology. This approach is extensively detailed in the NRCS technical release document known as TR55, officially titled Urban Hydrology for Small Watersheds. This foundational document provides extensive examples and clearly defines curve numbers for various cover crops and soil types, making it essential for understanding the hydrology of small watersheds. The curve number methodology is a widely adopted technique, frequently incorporated into many public and proprietary hydrologic models. At its core, curve numbers are empirically derived values. These values are used to predict the volume of runoff that will occur from a specific rainfall event, and they vary significantly based on the soil type and the land cover present in a watershed. Ultimately, this methodology allows us to predict event-specific runoff depths and volumes, which is crucial for water resource management and design. The SCS curve number method, often referred to as SCS-CN, is fundamentally based on something called hydrologic soil groups, or HSG. These groups, categorized as A, B, C, and D, are crucial because they reflect a soil's minimum infiltration rate. This rate is determined for bare soils after they've been thoroughly wetted. Essentially, these groups classify soils based on how quickly water can infiltrate them, which in turn gives us a strong indication of their runoff potential. These are the typical curve numbers, or CNs, that we use in rainfall excess and runoff volume studies, particularly as traditionally applied for flood control. Now, there's an important exception to these standard table values, especially when we're evaluating low-volume rain events. When generating annual runoff coefficients, the curve number used is 95. This is done specifically to ensure that the calculated runoff volumes match the observed streamflow volumes within a watershed, and to effectively utilize the tables found in Appendix N of the applicant's handbook. These runoff coefficient values were initially calculated by Harper in 2007, considering rainfall events that exceeded 0.1 inches. So, for impervious areas, the curve number used for annual runoff coefficients is 95, not the 98 you might otherwise expect. Another critical point to remember is that these values apply to separate rain events. Consequently, when conducting simulations, the storage capacity must be carefully adjusted based on both the frequency and the volume of the rainfall. This was a key part of Harper's extensive simulations. When looking at the general curve numbers, published in TR55 for residential and urban areas, we find some significant limitations. These numbers often do not distinguish between the discharge coming from directly connected impervious areas and that from pervious surfaces. Even when considering combined land use residential data, the values might assume impervious areas but fail to account for the directly connected ones. Consequently, using an average curve number, as might be suggested in these general guidelines, does not typically produce an acceptable or accurate runoff volume. It simply isn't precise enough for effective hydrological modeling. A much more accurate approach is offered by the Harper methodology. This method calculates runoff separately for pervious and impervious areas, which is a key difference. By doing so, it avoids having to assume a specific percentage of imperviousness or a fraction of pervious area, leading to more reliable results. It's also recommended that this methodology should evaluate loadings on an average annual basis for comprehensive assessment. Regarding specific land cover types, water areas, for instance, are assigned both a curve number and a C value of 0. This is because, over an annual cycle, precipitation and evaporation are considered to be approximately equal in these areas, balancing each other out. For wetlands, a general curve number value of 87 is often assigned. However, it's important to recognize that each wetland is unique and has different storage characteristics. Therefore, a fixed curve number cannot always be accurately applied. If you know the specific storage capacity within a particular wetland, you can actually back-calculate a more precise curve number for that individual wetland, providing a much more tailored and accurate assessment. Beyond just the main hydrologic soil groups, we also categorize them further into subsets based on varying hydrologic conditions. These conditions are defined as poor, fair, or good, and they are determined by a combination of factors that significantly affect both infiltration into the soil and the amount of runoff generated. Key factors include the density and canopy of vegetative areas, the amount of year-round cover present, the extent of grass or close-seeded legumes, the percentage of residue cover on the land surface, where good conditions typically mean at least 20% residue cover, and the degree of surface roughness. Let's break down what each condition means. Under poor conditions, the factors present tend to impair infiltration and significantly increase runoff. This means less water soaks into the ground. Fair conditions represent typical or average runoff scenarios, serving as a baseline. Finally, good conditions are those where factors actively encourage average and often better than average infiltration, thereby tending to decrease runoff. These land conditions, which govern how much rainfall becomes excess runoff, were critical in simulations. For instance, these definitions were directly applied in our models of rainfall excess using actual rain data collected in Florida. We're now going to discuss the SCS, or National Resources Conservation Service, method for calculating rainfall excess, which is essentially the runoff volume. This method estimates runoff volume using equations where soil storage, denoted as S, is calculated based on a curve number, or CN value. The curve number itself is determined by factors such as the cover crop, which means the land use, and the specific soil type. This calculation is typically done in English units, specifically inches. This relationship between soil storage and the curve number is a well-defined aspect of the method and is crucial for simulations like those used in Harper. Once soil storage is determined, runoff, particularly from the non-directly connected impervious areas, can then be calculated. However, it's important to recognize that the SCS method can be prone to significant errors, especially when dealing with averaged curve number values. This issue becomes particularly pronounced in situations involving directly connected impervious areas or mixed land uses. Simply averaging CN values, or even weighting them by area, doesn't always provide accurate results. To mitigate these errors, the SCS method has been modified. It's now recommended to calculate separate runoff volumes for the directly connected impervious areas, or DCIAs, and the non-DCIA areas. The rainfall excess from the DCIA should be calculated separately and then added to that from the pervious areas. Furthermore, for pervious areas that have widely different curve numbers, the rainfall excess should also be calculated separately for each distinct CN value, and then these individual excesses should be added together. This approach of weighting by runoff volume is preferred over simply averaging curve numbers to achieve more accurate results. Here we examine the crucial relationships between the runoff volume fraction, often referred to as the C value, and two key hydrological parameters: the percent directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, and the curve number, CN. The C value exhibits a linear relationship with the DCIA. This means that as the directly connected impervious area increases, the runoff volume fraction increases proportionally. However, the relationship between the C value and the curve number is exponential, making it nonlinear. This nonlinear behavior has significant implications for our calculations. Specifically, it implies that when attempting to average curve numbers across different land uses or subbasins to reproduce an accurate total runoff volume, a simple arithmetic average is generally not sufficient. Because of the exponential nature of the relationship, a simple average of CN values will often lead to an overestimation of the actual runoff volume. This can result in inaccurate rainfall excess calculations, underscoring the need for more sophisticated methods when aggregating curve numbers. Directly connected impervious areas, or DCIA, refers to those impervious surfaces that are directly connected to the stormwater conveyance system. However, the precise definition and calculation of DCIA can vary significantly depending on the type of analysis we're conducting. For instance, when we're performing flood routing for major storm events, the DCIA typically encompasses all impervious areas from which runoff discharges directly into the drainage system. This definition can also extend to situations where runoff discharges as a concentrated shallow flow over pervious areas, such as roadside swales, before it enters the drainage system. In these flood routing scenarios, DCIA is often generously estimated to provide an additional safety factor for design. Conversely, when we're focused on annual runoff estimation for common daily events, the definition of DCIA is more restrictive. Here, DCIA includes only those impervious areas from which runoff discharges directly into the drainage system during these smaller events. Notably, this definition generally does not include swales, as they are often considered a best management practice that helps filter or slow down runoff. This distinction usually results in a lower DCIA value for annual runoff estimation compared to what would be used for flood routing. When we talk about non-directly connected impervious areas, or non-DCIA, we're referring to all pervious areas combined with any impervious surfaces that aren't considered directly connected to the stormwater conveyance system. For the impervious parts within these non-DCIA areas, especially when considering runoff volume, after an initial rainfall threshold of 0.1 inch, a curve number of 95 is typically applied. To determine the overall non-DCIA curve number, particularly when you have a mix of land uses, one common approach is to use an area-weighted average. As you see in the formula, this involves multiplying the pervious area by its respective curve number, adding that to the non-DCIA impervious area multiplied by 95, and then dividing by the total combined area. It's important to note that while weighting by area is a straightforward approach and may be consistent with older designs or other code specifications, a more accurate method involves calculating the actual runoff volume associated with a rain event for each land use and soil type, and then determining a composite curve number based on those runoff volumes. This decision, whether to weight by area or by runoff volume, is a collective one, typically made collaboratively by permit applicants and the review agency professional. The good news is that software tools like BMPFast provide you with the option to perform calculations using either a simple average, a weighted area average, or a weighted runoff volume average, giving you flexibility in your analysis. When calculating runoff volumes, it's crucial to perform separate calculations for the directly connected impervious areas, or DCIA, and the non-DCIA areas, which are typically pervious. Attempting to use a single overall curve number, or CN value, for the entire area would introduce significant errors into your runoff estimates. For runoff from non-DCIA areas, which are the pervious surfaces, the calculation yields a depth term in inches. This calculation incorporates pi, which represents the rainfall depth for a specific event, and RNDCIAI, which is the rainfall excess for the non-DCIA area for that event. A key component here is S, the storage volume, which is directly calculated from the curve number using the formula S equals 1000 divided by the curve number, minus 10. This S value is central to the SCS method for estimating runoff from pervious surfaces. Conversely, runoff volume from the DCIA, or directly connected impervious surfaces, is calculated more simply as a depth term in inches. Using the formula RDCIAI equals pi minus 0.1, this 0.1 represents the initial abstraction, which accounts for factors like interception and surface depression storage before runoff begins. It's important to note that for both the DCIA and the pervious areas, if the rainfall depth pi is less than this 0.1 initial abstraction, then the runoff volume is considered to be zero. Curve number values aren't static. They need to be adjusted over time based on the prevailing soil conditions, which we refer to as antecedent moisture condition or AMC. For the simulated runoff volume data, these CN values are specifically modified to reflect whether the soil is dry, normal, or wet. These adjustments are critical and take into account factors like how long the soil has been dry before an event, as well as the current season of growth. This ensures a more accurate representation of potential runoff. Here, we're looking at the specifics of our hydrologic simulation modeling. We conducted a continuous simulation of runoff, simulating a hypothetical 1-acre site using the well-established SCS curve number methodology. Our simulations leveraged an extensive historical rainfall data set, drawing from 45 different rainfall sites, each providing hourly data. These sites offered varying lengths of records, ranging from 13 to 64 years, though most contained 30 or more years of reliable hourly rainfall data. This resulted in a substantial number of events, with an average of 4,685 individual rain events modeled per site. Runoff was meticulously calculated for every single one of these rain events at each location. To cover a broad spectrum of watershed conditions, we varied two key parameters in our simulations. We used directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, percentages ranging from 0 to 100% in 5-unit intervals. For the non-DCIA areas, we utilized curve numbers ranging from 30 to 95 in 5-unit intervals, also including a specific value of 98 as an ending point for certain conditions. Combining these variations across all our rainfall sites, we performed a staggering 15,750 individual simulations. The primary output we calculated from this extensive modeling effort was the average annual runoff coefficient, or ROC. This coefficient represents the ratio of the total runoff depth generated over the simulation period to the total rainfall depth over that same period, effectively quantifying how much of the precipitation ultimately becomes runoff on an average annual basis. For our runoff modeling, we included 45 meteorological sites. At each of these 45 locations, we conducted hourly simulations using the historical rainfall record available. The primary objective was to determine the capture volume for various combinations of curve number, CN, and directly connected impervious area, DCIA values. We varied these CN and DCIA values in increments of 5 units, performing runoff volume modeling for every rain event at each site over its entire available period of record. This extensive process resulted in a significant number of model runs. Specifically, 350 different combinations of DCIA and non-DCIA were analyzed for each rainfall site. When multiplied by the 45 sites, this totals 15,750 individual model runs. It's important to note that if you need to determine capture for values that aren't exact multiples of 5, you'll need to perform interpolations. While these can certainly be done by hand, requiring careful calculations and thorough checking, using a specialized software package, such as BMPFast, can greatly streamline and automate this often complex process. Here we see an example of modeled ROC values. For instance, if we're determining the annual percentage of rainfall that leaves a site as runoff, we can use the Miami data, which covers 64 years from 1942 to 2005, with a directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, of 50% and an NDCIA-CN of 80. The resulting ROC value is 0.482. To put this in perspective for a completely connected impervious area, that ROC value would be 0.808. It's important to note that the ROC can never reach a value of 1 if there is any initial abstraction, such as in this case where there is no runoff for rain events under 0.10 inches. Here, we're looking at visual plots illustrating the annual runoff coefficient, or ROC, as a function of both the directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, and the curve number for the non-DCIA area. We have data presented for 2 distinct sites, Pensacola, Tallahassee, and Key West. One significant observation you can make is the generally higher incidence of ROC for the Key West area, which is represented by the blue color on these plots, when compared to the Pensacola-Tallahassee sites. To give a specific example, if we consider a scenario with a catchment curve number of 70 and a DCIA value of 70, the annual runoff coefficient in Key West is approximately 0.4. However, for the same conditions in Pensacola, that annual runoff coefficient is considerably higher, at about 0.7. This clearly demonstrates the differing hydrological responses between these two regions. To identify areas with similar meteorological characteristics, we utilized a cluster analysis. This analysis specifically examined the annual rainfall and runoff relationships, using ROC values as a key metric. Crucially, the analysis didn't just consider the total annual rain volume, but also the distribution of that rainfall, giving significant weight to the inter-event dry periods. This detailed approach allowed us to identify 5 significantly different meteorological regions within the state. The differences among these regions are primarily due to the unique patterns of rainfall distribution, rather than simply the annual depth of rainfall. These distinct regions, which are typically defined by county boundaries, are shown visually in the accompanying illustration. Here we're looking at an example of a runoff calculation, or ROC, lookup table. These tables are crucial for determining runoff coefficients, and there is a specific one provided for each of the 5 meteorological zones across Florida. The ROC values themselves can be found in Appendix C of Harper & Baker's 2007 publication, as well as in the Applicant's Handbook, Appendix N, published by FDEP in 2024. For our example here, we are specifically viewing data pertinent to Zone 1, which encompasses the Panhandle region of the state. To effectively utilize these tables, several pieces of input data are essential. You'll need to identify the correct rainfall meteorological zone based on the rainfall zone map, determine the annual rainfall depth from isopleth maps, and have values for both the basin's directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, and the non-DCIA curve number. It's important to note that the BMPFast software, which often utilizes these tables, conducts interpolations for DCIA and curve number values that don't fall precisely into increments of 5. This ensures greater accuracy. Ultimately, by providing all these inputs and knowing the specific area, the system can calculate both the annual runoff coefficient value and the total annual runoff volume. To calculate the average annual runoff coefficient, or ROC, we commonly utilize tools such as BMPFast or standard spreadsheet programs. These methods are highly recommended due to their speed and accuracy, which are invaluable for these types of calculations. Furthermore, they allow for a robust sensitivity analysis, enabling us to quickly assess how changes in parameters like the curve number, directly connected impervious area, or other catchment characteristics can influence the final runoff coefficient. For instance, the example provided here, which uses the BMPFast software, clearly illustrates the ease with which you can input your specific site and watershed data, and then immediately see the calculated annual ROC displayed. The Tools menu within BMPFast offers powerful capabilities for sensitivity analysis, which we can think of as a discovery process. When you utilize this feature, BMPFast generates a complete table of runoff coefficient, or ROC, values specific to the rain zone, and presents them as a function of the curve number, or CN, and the directly connected impervious area, or DCIA values. This discovery tool is incredibly useful for examining how changes to your input data will affect your results. For instance, in this particular scenario, the ROC is 0.307. It's important to note that performing two-way interpolations for these types of calculations by hand can be quite challenging, especially when your CN and DCIA values don't fall neatly into increments of 5. We've previously established that separating a catchment area into a directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, and a pervious area allows for a more accurate calculation of rainfall excess. Building on this concept, a similar principle applies when dealing with a disconnected DCIA. In such a scenario, the DCIA will produce a certain volume of runoff, while the pervious area will generate another. The key to more accurate calculations for rainfall excess, especially in mixed land use scenarios, is to add these individual runoff volumes together. This method provides a much more precise total than simply averaging curve number values. Consequently, when we back-calculate the curve number from this combined runoff, the resulting value is significantly more accurate than a simple average or an average weighted solely by the areas involved. To facilitate these precise calculations, professionals should utilize the routines available within the BMPFast software. It's crucial to understand the specific calculation routine indicated by the plus sign within the catchment characteristic sheet. This understanding, often developed after initial manual calculations, ensures correct application of the software for accurate results. Here we're comparing two fundamental approaches to site design that significantly impact stormwater runoff. Designs that maximize directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, versus designs that minimize it. When we talk about maximizing DCIA, we're referring to scenarios where impervious surfaces, such as roofs and driveways, drain directly to the street, often channeled by a curb and gutter system. This design efficiently collects runoff and sends it off-site quickly, but it also means the entire volume of water from those impervious surfaces becomes runoff. In contrast, designs that minimize DCIA redirect that runoff. For example, a roof might drain to a lawn, or a driveway might drain into a grassed swale instead of directly to the street. This effectively disconnects the impervious area from the storm sewer system. By doing so, the runoff from the impervious surface is allowed to infiltrate into the ground or be treated by vegetation in the pervious area before it can become surface runoff. The impact of disconnecting DCIA is significant. Designs that minimize DCIA can substantially reduce the total generated runoff volume, and consequently, the required size of any downstream treatment systems. Our analysis shows that when impervious areas are disconnected in this manner, the annual runoff coefficient, or ROC, values decrease across every rain zone. This reduction in annual runoff can be quite significant, both in terms of water volume and the mass loadings of pollutants. It's important to note a key hydrological consideration. When a pervious area receives runoff from a disconnected impervious area, its effective curve number, or CN value, actually increases. This accounts for the added volume of water it must now manage, reflecting its altered hydrologic behavior. Ultimately, by thoughtfully disconnecting DCIA, we can achieve meaningful reductions in stormwater runoff. Let's walk through an example of hand calculations for runoff volume. These manual calculations are incredibly useful for understanding the underlying principles before we apply software like BMPFast. For our project, we have a 90-acre site dedicated to single-family residential development. There are also 5 acres of preserved wetlands on the site, which we'll consider non-contributing for runoff calculations. We'll compare the runoff volumes for this same site if it were located in the Pensacola area, representing Rain Zone 1, versus the Key West area, which falls into Rain Zone 3. Regarding ground cover and soil types, the residential areas are assumed to have lawns in good condition. Critically, the soil types throughout the developed area fall into hydrologic soil group D. Now, let's look at the impervious and directly connected impervious areas, often referred to as DCIA. For the residential areas, we're assuming 25% of the total developed site is impervious. So, for our 90-acre site, 25% of that gives us 22.50 acres of impervious surface. Of that impervious area, 75% is considered directly connected. This means 22.50 acres multiplied by 0.75 results in 16.88 acres of DCIA. When expressed as a percentage of the total developed area, the DCIA makes up 18.75%. It's really important as we proceed with these calculations to separately determine the runoff volume from the DCIA and from the remaining pervious areas. Continuing our hand calculations, we're now focusing on calculating the non-DCIA curve number using area weighting. We have a pervious area consisting of lawns in good condition, which falls under hydrologic soil group D. This gives us a curve number of 80 for that pervious area, which totals 67.5 acres. Additionally, we have an impervious area of 5.62 acres that is not directly connected to the drainage system, meaning it contributes runoff to the pervious area. We're assuming a curve number of 95 for this impervious surface. By area weighting these two components, the 67.5 acres of pervious lawn with a curve number of 80 and the 5.62 acres of non-DCIA impervious area with a curve number of 95, we arrive at a combined non-DCIA curve number of 81.15. As an additional exercise, using your BMPFast software and its watershed catchment area worksheet, consider what the curve number would be if we weighted it by runoff volume instead of by area. You can enter these numbers into the software, and we'll show you the result in slides toward the end of this presentation. Here, we continue our example calculations, focusing on how to determine the annual runoff volume for a developed area in Pensacola. The project site is 90 acres, and it's important to note that we're excluding the 5-acre stormwater management area from this calculation, as its runoff is already factored into the performance efficiency of the stormwater system itself. For Pensacola, which falls into Zone 1, we identify the hydrologic characteristics as having a directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, of 18.75%, which translates to 16.875 acres. The non-DCIA curve number is 81.15. Using these values, specifically an area-weighted curve number of 81.15 and the DCIA percentage, the applicant's handbook, Appendix N, for Zone 1, allows us to interpolate and find an annual runoff coefficient, or ROC, of 0.3015. This interpolation can be quite time-consuming, so specialized software or a small computer program is often beneficial. We actually validated this interpolated ROC value using BMPFast software. Next, we need the annual rainfall for Pensacola, which, from the isopleth map, is 65.5 inches. With all these figures, we can calculate the annual generated runoff volume. We multiply the project area of 90 acres by the annual rainfall of 65.5 inches per year, convert inches to feet by dividing by 12, and then multiply by our annual ROC value of 0.3015. This gives us an annual generated runoff volume of 148.1 acre-feet per year. This value closely matches what you would get if you used the BMPFast software, with any minor differences likely due to rounding conventions. We'll demonstrate the use of BMPFast to achieve this answer in later slides. Let's continue our calculation example, this time focusing on a developed area in Key West. Here, we determine the annual runoff coefficient based on Key West's specific meteorological zone and its unique hydrologic characteristics. For Key West, which is designated as Zone 3, we have a directly connected impervious area, or DCIA, of 18.75%, and a non-DCIA curve number of 81.15. The annual runoff coefficient value for Key West, found in Volume 1, Appendix N of the applicant's handbook, is 0.264. The average annual rainfall for Key West derived from the isopleth map is 40.0 inches. Using these figures, we can calculate the annual generated runoff volume. Taking the 90 acres, multiplying by 40.0 inches of rain per year, converting inches to feet, and then multiplying by our runoff coefficient of 0.264. This gives us an annual runoff volume of 79.2 acre-feet per year. It's worth noting that this result precisely matches the runoff volume calculated by the BMPFast software, demonstrating its accuracy and efficiency for these types of computations. Now, let's put this into perspective by comparing it to our Pensacola example. The runoff volume at Key West, at 79.2 acre-feet, represents 53.5% of the runoff volume we calculated for Pensacola. Interestingly, The average yearly rainfall in Key West is about 61% of that in Pensacola. This highlights a crucial point. Due to differences in rainfall patterns, including timing and volume across the state, the runoff volume in a location like Key West isn't simply a direct fraction of the rainfall calculated in another part of the state, such as Pensacola. We're now going to look at a practical application of BMPFast, specifically focusing on how it uses area weighting for curve number calculations. To illustrate the input and output results for runoff volume using BMPFast, we'll be examining data from the Pensacola area. We've entered the specific site and watershed characteristics for this location into the tool. Our primary interest here is in evaluating the loadings from the post-development condition. So we are using a BMP analysis to assess the performance standard. You'll notice that the curve number value for the pervious area has been calculated as an area averaged CN for both the impervious and pervious surfaces, resulting in a value of 81.15. What's important to highlight is that the results generated by BMPFast for this scenario are consistent with those obtained through manual or hand calculations. We're now focusing on the Pensacola area as an example to illustrate how BMPFast works, particularly with its new runoff volume weighting for curve number calculations. For this demonstration, the specific characteristics of the Pensacola site and its watershed have been entered into the system. To delve into the specifics of the curve number calculation, you would access that routine directly adjacent to the post-condition non-DCIA curve number. Here, we've used a curve number of 95 for the disconnected DCIA. The overall composite curve number, which is based on a weighting of runoff volumes, is calculated to be 82.07. Since our primary interest in this scenario is analyzing the loadings from the post-development condition, a BMP analysis is subsequently used to establish the performance standard. When we calculate the curve number, or CN, by weighting it according to the runoff volume, we arrive at a value of 82.06. This is notably higher than a simple area-weighted CN, which in this instance was 81.15. This difference has a direct and significant impact on the predicted runoff volume. Specifically, using the runoff volume weighted CN produces a larger total volume of runoff, amounting to 152.402 acre-feet, compared to the 148.103 acre-feet obtained with an area-weighted CN. To understand how this works, the runoff volumes from both the pervious areas and any disconnected impervious areas are combined. A CN value is then calculated that precisely accounts for this cumulative runoff sum. In essence, this method of weighting the CN by runoff volume tends to yield a higher overall runoff prediction than a calculation based solely on an area-weighted curve number. We've covered several important concepts about runoff volume and its impact. We learned that similar to rainfall, runoff volume in Florida is highly variable, which directly leads to highly variable loadings. This variability is significantly influenced by both rainfall patterns and the specific designs of catchment areas. We explored the direct relationship between runoff and the percentage of impervious area, where higher imperviousness typically means more runoff. We also discussed the exponential relationship between the curve number, or CN value, and runoff volume. A crucial point we addressed is that when disconnecting impervious areas, it's essential to carefully consider the runoff volume generated from these now disconnected surfaces. We also looked at how the new stormwater rule and the BMPFast software utilize the 2007 report methodology for calculating runoff volumes, while also accommodating the updates stipulated in the 2024 Applicant's Handbook. We saw how comparing example projects using hand calculations to those processed with BMPFast demonstrates the software's ability to provide timely and accurate computations. Finally, we established that for mixed land uses, runoff should be calculated separately for each distinct land use condition. For instance, distinguishing between directly connected impervious areas and other land uses. The good news is that BMPFast offers efficient ways to facilitate these timely and accurate calculations for complex scenarios. Ultimately, Accurate runoff volume calculations, based on field-observed data like rainfall, event mean concentrations, and watershed characteristics, are critical for correctly determining loadings. This concludes our presentation by Harvey Harper and Marty Wanyalista on runoff volume generation in Florida. Thank you for viewing. We encourage you to proceed to the other learning modules to delve deeper into stormwater management for water quality improvement.